Welcome to Wild Heart Revival, a gathering place for heartfelt conversations and stories as pathways of renewal and revival. I am your host, Tay Tayari, and today's guest is Justin Waxman. This conversation is both far ranging and enlightening as we embark on a journey through time and culture to explore the captivating story of cacao. Justin gracefully guides us through the origins, flows, and modern day world market complexities of the sacred superfood fruit, commonly known as chocolate, and revered by its ancient cultivators as the food of the gods. Justin is a cacao and tree to bar chocolate expert. He resides on the island of Ometepe in Nicaragua, where he teaches about the magical world of cacao and the intersectionality it has through our lives. He enjoys sharing experiences that deeply connect people to the natural world around them and guides cacao farm tours, medicinal plant walks, and mushroom forages. He loves to hike in the forests, plant seeds of wisdom and beauty, and remember the ancestral world back to life again through the ancient art of storytelling. If you are curious about any of my other offerings, such as the personalized threshold counseling that I provide for individuals and couples, or if you're interested in reading my latest essays, simply visit coyotecouncil.earth. You'll find a direct link in the show notes. Additionally, you're invited to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, which provides updates on new podcast episodes alongside other creative happenings. You can subscribe on our website. Now, let us follow the captivating chronicles of cacao with our dear guest, Justin Waxman.
Great. Well, yeah, I'm particularly excited about this conversation because I have a hunch that many people around the world who are ingesting cacao, taking it into their bodies, don't really know much about it as a plant, the cultural history, the kind of geopolitical flows that are at play today with the plant. And so, you being some kind of expert on this topic, I'm really excited to unearth like, the mystery of cacao and yeah, bring some knowledge and hopefully some future wisdom to people's orientation toward cacao and their relationship with it, hopefully deepening their relationship with it. So I think a good place to start would be to explore the origins of cacao as far as we know it, as it's been handed down, the stories from indigenous peoples of this area. And I'll introduce you now. This is Justin. We're at El Pital. I'll give a proper introduction that I'll tag onto the front of this. But if we want to just get into it, I think that the origin story is a good way.
The origin story is perfect. Yeah, I think first it helps me to acknowledge with a lot of humility and a lot of respect the privilege that I have to be able to work so intimately with cacao, especially coming from where I come from, which is the United States, which is, of course, one of the places that have colonialized and exploited cacao for far too long. And so, who am I as an expert to be sharing stories, especially stories that come from indigenous wisdom from this part of the world? And I think that first it helps. It's important to acknowledge that these stories that I've learned, these stories that I've listened to, these stories that I continue to tell, they're not my stories. They do not belong to me. They belong to the people who live on this land and who have been living in Mesoamerica indigenously for thousands of years. And these are their stories. But unfortunately, like a lot of colonialization and several hundred years of trauma from that, these stories have been lost. And so even I find a lot of indigenous people who do live on these lands, they know just the basics about cacao. They know that it was their oldest currency, they know that there was rituals done about them, but that's about where it ends. And so in order for me to share these stories, I first had to listen, and listen very carefully, and do a lot of research and dive deep into this world of cacao so that I have, it's a privilege that I do get to share these stories. And as somebody who to tell stories, as a storyteller, it's it's a very old profession, the storyteller. And back in the times of the Mayans, it was a very revered and respected part of the village. And they would have jobs basically subsidized by the entire village. And their role would be to go every single night to different homes and sit around fires all night long and tell stories until the sun rose. Some of the most beautiful stories that have ever been told have been told around those fires, and those stories were never really intended to be written down in the first place, because their language was so ingrained with these stories that they would never have been allowed to forget them, because their everyday words would always be referencing parts of their stories. And it was really only until pretty recently in history that some of these stories were actually written down. In the Popol Vuh, for example, which is the book of the council, the book of the people for the Quiche Mayans, they wrote it down 450 years ago, only because, and they say this in the introduction, that the preaching God of Jesus had come to their land, and if they had not written these stories down, they were afraid that they would have been lost forever. And grateful that they did, because certainly those stories would have been lost.
Right.
So it's with a lot of humility that I can share these stories in a clear and coherent way, but I can only do my best and only do the versions that I know of in telling these stories.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
So with that said, we hear people say that money doesn't grow on trees, but of course here in Mesoamerica that phrase wouldn't really carry a lot of sense, because cacao is the oldest currency here. And instead of playing this sort of capitalism game that we play today with debt and everything they invented, what they had here, and especially here specifically in Nicaragua, you have more of this circular-based gift economy, where the villages and the families themselves would collectively own trees, cacao trees. They would use it in their community and trade it amongst themselves, creating like a circular-based gift economy, and it was how they traded with everything. Cacao was their main currency. They also traded corn, they traded chilies, tobacco, cotton, and various things, but cacao was their most prized and universally traded currency, from the tribes going all the way to the south of America in the Amazon, all the way up to the tribes in Mexico. They were using cacao as their currency. But that's not where its origin is. The true origin of cacao as a fruit dates back before written history. Its oral stories can take it back about 10,000 years to the northern Amazon basin, where indigenous people first discovered this fruit growing in what we would consider today to be Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. But they weren't using cacao like we know today when they first discovered it. They were eating the fruit raw, and they were also turning it into a cider, into like a wine from the sugar of the pulp itself. But humans and cacao have always been linked together, and so over a period of about 6,000 to 7,000 years, humans carried this fruit out of the Amazon north into Mexico, where it was domesticated in the Soconusco Valley, which is southwest Mexico and western Guatemala. It's a valley of volcanoes where the Olmec tribes lived. And we know that the Olmecs were the first to use cacao because we found theobromine in some of their burial vessels, so they must have been using it. But besides that, we don't know much about the Olmecs, nor even what they called themselves.
Theobromine being an essential component of
the
cacao.
main alkaloid of cacao, and cacao is the highest source of theobromine in the world. They also found very small traces of caffeine, and in this part of the world back then, there was only one plant that had both theobromine and caffeine in it, and it was cacao. They were called the Olmecs only by the Aztecs. It's actually from a Nahuatl word, which means the rubber people, because they were the first to tap the rubber tree, and they created a game out of it, which was later adapted by the Mayans as this very famous Mayan ball game.
Oh, so the ball was created from the rubber.
Right. So that's why they call this tribe the Olmec tribe.
I see.
But this is not what they called themselves. They didn't leave us much of a written language. There's a few hieroglyphics that are pretty indecipherable today, and some statues that the Olmecs left behind. But
some interesting statues too, right?
Very interesting ones.
Yeah, like where they almost look like Africans, some of them.
In a way.
Like in the way their characteristics. It's
right.
Yeah, they look different in their physical orientation than you would expect.
Right.
I was surprised. Yeah.
But when the Olmecs sort of disappeared is when you see the classical Maya show up.
Okay.
And so either the Olmecs or the Mayans were the ones who gave us the word for cacao.
Right.
Cacao is in Quiche Maya, spelled K-A-K-A-W, or you'll sometimes see it written as K-A-K-A-U, cacao, which this word itself comes from Quiche Maya, and like most Mayan words, it has a lot of different meanings, because when they called something, it could have meant 10 different things, right? Because it was always tied back into their stories. So the root of this word, if you split apart its syllables, ka means fish. Cacao is a reference to two fishes, and you might be thinking, well, what does cacao have to do with fishes?
Yeah.
And it really is one of their oldest allegorical stories that's written in the Popol Vuh about the journey of the hero twins, who were birthed by two cacao seeds from their father, Hunapu, who was could be seen as an allegory of the tree from the underworld, the cacao tree. They say that it was a hikaro, this fruit that he was, but in reality, it makes more sense that he was cacao. And then when they say a hikaro, it's because they would drink cacao from their hikaro. So the hero twins were two cacao seeds that were born into this world. The hero twins go through this journey of life full of magic. Then they go into the underworld, where they play this ball game, this Mayan ball game with the Lords of the Death, and they trick them. And then they tell them, when we die, they knew they were going to survive the Lords of the Death. So they said, when we do die, throw us into the fire, crush our bones up into a powder or a paste, and then throw it into the river. And when they threw it into the river, they were resurrected as two magical fishes that then swam upstream back into the world of the living, and then they transformed back into the hero twins, so that then they can resurrect their father. And the blessing that they were given for this was one of them became the sun and one of them became the moon. And then the god of corn decided to come and create the third attempt to make humans, which they say Mesoamericans were made from corn, their body mixed with water to make a dough, and cacao and other fruits. And cacao specifically, they said, was gathered to make humans and used to make our hearts and used to make a part of our brain. So every time the Mayans said the word cacao, they were remembering this entire journey that the hero twins went through life, death, and resurrection. It is another way you can say and reference the heart or the blood system as well. It has a lot of ties to that idea of a heart and the blood. And it also, people say today that the word cacao also literally translates into the food of the gods, because it was this gift, this nourishment gift that was given by the gods. And that also is part of Aztec mythology of Quetzalcoatl, who is described as the plumed serpent god, who brought both corn and cacao to the people by transforming into an ant, going into the underworld, into the mountain of the gods, and stealing the grain of corn and stealing the grain of cacao and bringing it back from the death into the world of the living, where it was then a gift from the gods to the people. So that's kind of where its origin story as a word itself originates from.
Fascinating. Interesting. Okay, so then I mean, my mind, because you brought up that god Quetzalcoatl,
Yeah.
it made me think about the Spanish coming over, because I know that mythology is really tied up in the story of the Spanish coming over and conquesting with the Aztecs. And I'm curious of what you could share and how cacao was maybe absorbed or rejected by the Spanish. I don't know about that, but
when you say how it's tied up, what stories have you heard about that? Because I've heard stories that have been, kind of contradicted.
Okay, yeah. So I've heard that that maybe there was a mythological story that said that one day this god Quetzalcoatl would one day come back over the seas to free or to liberate the people of the land. And this was at a time when what was his name, the king, the divine king of the Aztecs, Moctezuma. This was at a time where he was in reign, and he was this, as far as I've heard, this really dominating force. And so there's this interesting exploration of how Quetzalcoatl was possibly being seen as the Spanish, like the Spanish were a representation of that god coming over to liberate some of the people who were under the rule of Moctezuma and the Aztec kingdom, and that actually played a part in like kind of helping them in a way, because it instilled fear in the Aztecs and Moctezuma in particular, but it also kind of allowed for some of the other peoples of the land to see these lighter skinned Spanish in shiny armor riding deer, which are horses, in this kind of godlike way that was tied to some mythological story.
So let me challenge that point.
Great, do it.
Because
Yeah.
I heard this too.
Yeah.
And somebody challenged me on that. They're like, well, when did that story come about, that Quetzalcoatl will return? And some people even say it would be a white man with a beard.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
That story only showed up about 50 years after the Spanish arrived. It is a hindsight, let me challenge this, it's a hindsight 2020 thing where the Spanish, which were already conquering, right, using force, and they were ruthless, right?
Oh, yeah.
They needed to share another story. They needed to start to change the stories to make them seem like the savior. Like not the ruthless barbarians, but the savior of the Indians.
Right.
I challenge this completely because it's this whitewashed myth of a white savior coming in and saving the indigenous people from themselves. This didn't happen.
Right.
Quetzalcoatl was a plumed serpent, a feathered serpent creature.
Yeah.
And this idea that...
but gods would come down in human form too, right?
Sometimes, but this was a way... There's this great line, it's not mine, where it says, when the Spanish came here, they had the Bible and the indigenous had the land. They said, close your eyes and pray. And when they opened their eyes, the indigenous had the Bible and the Spanish had the land.
Yeah.
So this is, I think, one of those ways of trying to indoctrinate the indigenous people with this idea of Jesus in a language that they can understand. Because now it's like, here's Jesus, but look, it was also Quetzalcoatl who is your Jesus. They baptized, to use that word, they baptized the gods here, the deities. So there's no indigenous... Prior to the Spanish arriving, there is no indigenous stories that actually tell that. That all happens after the fact.
That makes sense to me, man.
Yeah.
That totally makes sense. So thank you for that reframe.
So I get that. That's not how I see it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So before getting into that, I'm curious to see how cacao was then. Like, I love that was just challenged, and that makes sense. So then I'm curious how cacao, this one of the most revered plants, currency, food of the gods, connection to the gods, like how that was taken in by the Spanish or rejected, like what that relationship was. But maybe before going there, I'm curious about maybe more of like, what was the day to day, like before the Spanish arrived? What do we know about like how cacao was being utilized in day to day? Was it primarily ceremonial? Were people just drinking it in their homes? I guess
it was a very luxurious thing, so it wasn't an everyday drink. It was something that was associated for rituals and holidays, mostly linked with the love and the blood, birth, marriages, and death.
Okay.
If you had a wedding, you would drink cacao. If there was a holiday to celebrate, you would drink cacao. They would use it sometimes to bring tribes together. Cacao lowers cortisol, makes us more calm, less stress, more in our body. At high doses, you express yourself in a more emotional but authentic way.
So like conflict resolution.
Couples therapy, these sort of ideas.
Right.
And this was something that was considered to be incredibly sacred. And it's actually part of that leaks into the subconscious of the people today, because what are the four most commercial chocolate consuming holidays? There's Halloween, which is about death, Christmas, which is about the birth, Easter, resurrection, and Valentine's Day, love. And cacao was also a part of that, because even through the journey of the Hero twins, as I alluded to earlier, it's another allegory of the method of making their drink. Something that is alive, this fruit, then goes into the underworld, which is a type of fermentation, right? Fermentation is transformation through decay. Then the bodies of the Hero twins are thrown into the fire, which is the roasting process. Then their bones were crushed, which is the grinding process, on the metate to make it into a paste, and then thrown into the water to make their drink. And so every time, again, they tell this story, they say the word cacao, all of these stories come back into life again. The journey of the Hero twins, the journey of life itself, life, death, and resurrection. So this was something they did consider to be very sacred to them. And we know the way they drank this because they also left us their recipes. And sometimes they had certain recipes changed for certain reasons. Like if it was specifically for love or if it was specifically for the blood, they would use different spices of it. But the base of this drink was always the same. The fruit itself would be harvested from the tree, They would ferment the beans inside for some amount of time. Some say a couple days. Some say they would wash it and dry it immediately, but it was always some form of fermentation. They would sun dry the cacao, which would then allow it to preserve and last for longer. They would roast the cacao on firewood over a comal, over firewood. Then they would peel the beans and crush the beans in the metate, volcanic stone grinder, and then they would mix it in a jicaro of water. Always water. The Mayans liked it hot. The Aztecs preferred it more like room temperature. Always water. Then they would add corn flour to thicken it up in most drinks. Sometimes not corn, but almost most of their drinks were corn and water based, which I can talk about later of why that's important. Obviously, the spiritual side of that is that it represents the complete human form, right? Corn and cacao together, mixed with water, which is a huge part of that whole system. So you're basically drinking this representation of the human body. Then they would add chilies to it. Chilies and spices and flowers, and we know several of the spices that they used to use indigenously here, well before things like cinnamon were added, which came from India. They would use achote, and they would use allspice berry, and they would use actual chilies from their garden. Chilies, which all peppers are indigenous to Central America. They didn't go anywhere else in the world until the last couple hundred years. And they would make this drink spicy. Then they would frothen it up, make it foamy and thick on the top by either pouring it from one vessel to another vessel to aerate the drink, or they later invented a minolio, which is like a little whisk to whisk up this drink and make it really frothy, and then they would drink it. And this drink of theirs that they drank, which they said was thick and spicy and frothy and bitter, they had two main names for it. They called it either cacahuatl or they called it chocolatey. And that last one is where the origin of the word chocolate comes from, chocolatey. Although perhaps there's another origin for the word chocolate. The Quiche Mayan had a word chocolaj, Xocolaj, chocolaj. And this word is the verb meaning to drink something together. So if you were to say chocolaj, it means we're about to drink something together. The Mayans called their drink, which also had corn and chili in it, cacao, which also could have dated back to the Olmec times, because the Olmecs had perhaps not had the word cacao originally. So chocolaj, cacao, we're about to drink cacao together. So either kind of one of those two stories is most likely where the etymology of the word chocolate comes from today. But they always drank it. It was always water-based. They liked it thick with corn, and they liked it spicy.
Yeah, and the spice helps with the absorption or the expansion in the body,
The
right?
vasodilation of theobromine is activated with capsaicin, which is the main active ingredient inside spicy peppers. As well, chilies accelerate or improve our blood circulation. So, they had honey here. They were great beekeepers. It's one of their oldest stories was how to keep the bees, and they worshipped bees, and they were great honey producers. So they could have made the drink sweet. They chose instead to make it spicy, and that's why. Because when you add chili to cacao, you actually feel the psychoactive effects of theobromine or anandamide or phenylethylamine or any of the other, many psychoactive properties. You feel it more enhanced with chili. Right. This is why in ceremonies today, which is a very New Age spiritual practice, but it's very common to add chili to it.
Yeah.
Cayenne or some other pepper.
I usually put cayenne in mine.
Right.
Yeah.
So this goes back, to a drink 4,000 years.
And the flavor is really nice when you put a little spice in it.
Yeah.
Like it really works.
It
just
definitely
flavor
works.
profile wise.
And you feel the effect. So after about 15, 30 minutes when the theobromine starts to really kick in, peaks 2 hours into the experience. Theobromine lasts 3 to 6 hours on average is the plateau at high doses. And then a very gradual come down at the finish. If you add chili to it, then you'll enhance those effects, and therefore you can get more high on the cacao. And we know that the cacao that they had back then, the Criollo varieties of cacao, had less antioxidants than the varieties that we have today, but they were more powerful in theobromine. So they were definitely using this drink to get high on, and using it for rituals, for using it for holidays. It was an adult beverage as well. The Mayans used to take people in their village traditionally through an initiation ritual around the age of puberty, somewhere around 12 to 14 years old. They would take all the young people into a beautiful initiation ritual, and it was only at the end of this ritual, when they were welcomed back as adults in the village, would they then finally be allowed to drink the drink of cacahuatl.
Oh, so when you became an adult.
Right. Just like we see today as coffee and alcohol.
Right.
They're typically seen as taboo to give to somebody under the age of puberty.
Right, so cacao.
And so that's how cacao was also treated here.
Yeah.
It was like, this is something that you should drink when you're an adult because it's potently psychoactive.
Mm-hmm. And also because maybe you'll be able to understand the depth of what that plant represents too.
In a way, but if you just look at the science behind it, it contains theobromine and caffeine. A little bit of caffeine, but it's
Right.
there, and it's a stimulant. So,
Yeah.
children who take stimulants, or children who eat chocolate,
Yeah.
I can almost guarantee when parents start to give their children chocolate, I'm like, first they're going to get really hyper,
Yeah.
then something's going to happen, they're going to cry, and then at the end they'll crash.
Yeah.
But what would you expect to happen if you gave a child coffee with sugar? You'd see the same thing. You'd see this peak in stimulation, something to make them go crazy and then cry, and then they would crash. So
Not ideal.
we make this mistake with children,
Yeah.
thinking that chocolate's not a stimulant.
Right.
Chocolate's definitely a stimulant.
Yeah.
It definitely has those properties to it. So
Yeah.
that's why, and also it's being related to love. Has always been an important aspect of this, because the spirit of cacao is a very feminine spirit. It's a very soft and gentle spirit. It's a very loving spirit, though, and it was always associated with the planet Venus, which the Mayans had a different perspective of Venus. They saw it as there's two sides of Venus, whereas the European perspective of Venus is that it's a much more feminine and loving planet. The Mayans kind of said it's both the morning star and the evening star, and there was half the year when it had some of these more feminine qualities, but there was another half of the year when it was also related to war, or to a more aggressive, darker side. But that darker side was also associated with cacao, because cacao is a shade-loving tree, and it's a tree that they say came from the underworld, which makes sense. And they said the underworld was a watery place. Cacao loves water, it loves shade, and they used to find wild cacao in cenotes in Mexico. And to them, if you see a cacao tree growing in the entrance of a cenote, that's the entrance to the underworld. So they would make this literal connection to that, of this tree was a gift from the underworld. It was always associated with death, but with a very gentle feminine spirit kind of associated to it as well.
Yeah. Huh.
And then to your other question, how did the Spanish then receive this stuff?
Yeah, because the Spanish were very obviously trying to eradicate like any kind of significant cultural aspects of these peoples, the Mayans, the Aztecs. And so now that you've explained, like, the cacao is actually like this central core plant teacher connection to ancestors, spirit, divinity, it makes sense that the Spanish would target that probably immediately. I'm very curious.
When they first came and saw it, first of all, they didn't like the drink. Chili was new to them. They hated the chili. They're like, what are these Native Americans doing? They're drinking this horribly bitter, spicy drink, and we don't understand it. But what they also observed right away, because when they arrived here, they had never tried anything that was stimulating with caffeine. Now again, it's more theobromine than caffeine, but coffee wouldn't have arrived to Europe until more than 100 years later.
From Ethiopia.
From Africa, the Middle East. Tea arrived from Asia, but that also arrived both after coffee and cacao. So one of the very first depictions, there was a Spanish, in the second expedition, a Spanish guy wrote a lot in his diary about what he was witnessing. And he thought that the indigenous people were superhuman, because he said they're drinking this drink in the morning, and then they're working so hard, nonstop, all throughout the day without stopping for a meal. Because to them, they're used to drinking alcohol all day long. Because in the Dark Ages, they didn't have anything stimulation. Their water was unsafe to drink.
Yeah.
You hear stories of the pirates, they drank more rum than water.
It was safer.
It was safer to drink it, right? So if you're drunk all the time, well, of course you're going to be in a depressing or dark spirit. That's what the Dark Ages represented in Europe, was the age of alcohol.
Right.
Whereas here, they were drinking cacao. And so they witnessed this thing, and they're like, this is some sort of magic. And that's also why when it first arrived to Europe, it was heralded as a medicine, and it was reserved for the aristocracy. It was a luxurious item that was heralded as a medicine that heals many, many illnesses, including, they said, it heals melancholy. Of course, we know that it has these antidepressant qualities to it, and they identified many things. So they revered it, and they understood it, and they also saw how they were addicted to it, not a physical way, but in an emotional way. This was so much a part of their story that they couldn't be separated from it. So if they were to try to tell, indigenous person that cacao is something that's just a candy bar, I mean, they would look at you like you're crazy. What do you mean? This is who we are. We are the people of the corn, but cacao is our blood. right? And this was our oldest currency, they would say. So that's
Are there any like first account stories about when a Spanish conquistador tried cacao and
Sure, it was
yeah.
Cortez. Actually, in
Cortez.
Montezuma, he recorded going to a banquet, going to a Montezuma feast, and seeing Montezuma drink 50 cups of cacao at this feast.
Whoa.
Which is very heroic doses of this
Whoa.
stuff. Sometimes at those feasts included psilocybin in the drinks.
Yeah.
They would also smoke tobacco. They had cigars here, which also was new to the Spanish because
Yeah.
they didn't have tobacco back then. Tobacco comes
Right.
from Mesoamerica. So they witnessed these things that they were doing in their feasts and their banquets, and they understood that this was something special. But specifically at the time that Montezuma was ruling, he was cruel in one way that I find to be unfair. For a period of about 200 years during the Aztec rule, which was mostly in Mexico and a bit of Guatemala, they said that this was such a luxurious currency that it should only be controlled by the elites. And for about 200 years, he forbid women to drink cacao, which was completely ridiculous and unfair. So by the time that Montezuma had it, he was a bit crazy anyway, and he was kind of hoarding all this wealth to himself and to the military, because he thought that this is the way that you pay people to sort of go around and conquer. And the Aztecs, although not as brutal as the Spanish called them out to be, were a lot less peaceful than the Mayans were. The Mayans were maybe the most peaceful, beautiful tribe that had ever existed. I think maybe even across the world. I mean, certainly anthropologists could correct me if I'm wrong, but they didn't even have they didn't even have doors in their village. They had these open thresholds, and this idea that somebody would enter into your private space and violate you or steal from you would be completely unheard of. This was something that they couldn't even fathom, so there was no need to build doors. And their wars of the Mayans were not true wars. They called them guerra floridas, the flowery wars. So what is a flowery war?
What is a flowery war?
Flowery war is where you dress up in your most beautiful clothing,
Yeah.
adorn yourself with flowers, carry cacao and incense and tobacco, and maybe some avocados or some other delicious fruits, and you go into another tribe, and with your highest, most beautiful, elevated speech that they would be trained for, they would recite their stories in a poetic way to basically woo them to not fight, and to either join their stories or to convince them in a non-violent way. This idea of total warfare, the Mayans didn't really have. They had their flowery wars, which is
that.
one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard.
I love that.
Because the purpose of the Mayans, the traditionalist Mayans, right?
Yeah.
And there's many of them that still exist today, although a lot of it has been baptized. So take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
The traditionalist Mayans believe that the gods created them, and it says this specifically in the Popol Vuh, because our job is to remember the world back together and give praise to the gods for creating us. And every single story they told was actually a branch off the big story, which all the stories flowed through, and all of our ancestors live in this tree, and all of us are like fruits from this tree, and all these little stories never really had a beginning or the ending, and they all tied back into other stories. And so they had so many stories, and their purpose on life is to go around and elevate speech, because they said the gods liked when we lit tobacco or incense. They liked it when we sang and made music, played flutes or drums. They liked those things. Sitting around the fire playing music was like delicious food for the gods. And our purpose is to create beauty, they said.
What an incredible flip on this idea of conflict and like warring. To, if there is some kind of conflict, because that naturally arises being in human communities,
Sure.
to rather than to create violence out of that, to see who can be the most beautiful, who can be the most loving and the most enticing with their elevated speech and their storying, so as to woo the opponent over into a greater sense of love and appreciation. Like that's so incredible.
Yeah.
I love that.
Delicious words to feed the gods.
I love that.
It's amazing stuff.
I heard that the Aztecs came to power through force, that they were originally quite a small band that was really aggressive, and that they took over through their aggression, and that's what they're really known for. And that's why by the time Moctezuma came to power, of course he was generations down the line, there was still this really kind of aggressive, dominating orientation, and that sacrifice is a big part of their culture too. I'm curious if you know about how the Mayans saw that sacrifice, and if the sacrifice culture, if that was connected to cacao at all, because it was connected to death, right?
Right.
So was cacao being used in these kinds of sacrificial rituals, or?
Well, there's some stories from the Aztecs, and again, when I was first challenged on this, that the Aztecs committed human sacrifice, it was a person from this land who said, well, how do you know that? And I said, well, that was told to me. And they said, well, how do you know that? And I said, well, let me look into that first. And so what I found about Aztec sacrifice was written down much later after the Spanish arrived here. So again, a lot of them had an influence to portray the Aztecs as more barbaric as they were, but there is some artwork that shows that they might have done that. So there could be elements of truth. But what is generally accepted in Aztec folklore is that they would have some controlled human sacrifice where for a whole year they would pick an individual and they would worship them like a god, Quetzalcoatl in human formation. They would treat them as a god, adorn them with whatever they want for an entire year. And then they would have this festival every year where they would give this person cacao and mushrooms and get them deliriously high, and then have them dance in the street as a god, and then at the end they would sacrifice this. There's another story from the Aztecs about their sort of, quote unquote Star Wars, where they got kind of paranoid and they said that the planets were telling them when to attack, and this is what actually doomed them the most, because the planets weren't telling them when to attack. They were just sort of misreading the stars. And so they overextended their military force, because every month something would happen in the stars and they would say, oh no, the gods want us to go to war again. And this is one of the things that led to their defeat, is the overextension of their military, which could be a very good lesson to many countries, especially with their military industrial complex of overextending and how empires actually collapse. But the Aztecs came as far south as here.
They did.
Oh, you didn't know that?
No.
So the word Nicaragua, where we are, Nicaragua, is translates into a phrase. The Spanish translation is "Hasta aquí llegaron los nahuales," which means in English, "Until here arrived the Nahuals." And the Nahuals were the Aztecs because they spoke a language called Nahuatl.
Yeah.
And when they came here and they conquered this whole area, they allowed different parts of this area to maintain their own systems. So the Nicarao tribe, which there was a leader named Cacique Nicarao, he was from Rivas, his family was. He controlled the state, which was Rivas, San Jorge, and Ometepe, which is this island that we're on. But we know as a fact that they came as far south as here, but specifically here, Ometepe. This is the southernmost point of the Aztec Empire. They did not go further south. They never went to Costa Rica, which is, a 45-minute bus ride from here when you get to off the island. Both the word itself, Ometepe, is obviously Nahuatl. Ometeo means two gods. It's the masculine and feminine coming together. Ometepe means two peaks, which is a reference to one of their oldest stories, which was, they say, a prophecy of the Aztec people. And Mexicans know this. People from the Mexica or the Nahuatl tribe in Mexico, they respect Nicaraguans a lot, because they say, you are our people too. Because when they say, so the prophecy goes something like this, and they said this before they found Ometepe, that one day they would find their paradise on earth. And this paradise on earth would be described as a place where two mountains would meet together, in which one of those mountains was made of fire and the other mountain was made of water. And that these two mountains that met together, one of fire, one of water, would be surrounded entirely by an ocean of sweet water. And that's what they found here.
Yeah.
And, maybe for those not knowing where we are, Ometepe is in the center of the largest lake of Central America. It is an island made up of two volcanoes. One of those volcanoes is active and there's still lava inside. And the other volcano is inactive and there's a lake in the crater. There's waterfalls and springs all around it. And it still sometimes erupts water.
Oh, wow.
And now they called this island Ometepe because of this prophecy. And the one of the biggest cities on this island, city is a very weird way to say it. It's one of the biggest villages on this island is called Altagracia. But the original name of the city was Aztegalpa. And Galpa means a place. So the place of the Aztecs is what Altagracia actually comes from.
So Moyogalpa means what?
You really want to know? It means the place of the zancudos, which is a mosquito. Home of the mosquitoes.
Okay.
Is the literal translation from Maugalpa.
Okay.
But of course, this island, these volcanoes were not named Conception and Maderas, which is what they're named today.
Yeah.
So the original name of Conception was Omeyataite, and it was a god of fire. And this volcano that we're sitting on right now is a goddess named Omeyatesiguat, which is a goddess of water. And of course, they had a child together because they fell in love, and their
So
child
gods
was
and goddesses do.
yeah, they do fall in love and they have children. And Queotiat was their child, which
Okay.
in the Nicaragua legend was the god of rain, thunder, storms, and lightning, and which was always in all of Mesoamerican mythology one of the more powerful gods were the water gods. Like for the Nahuatls it was Tlaloc, which was this water god, this god of rain and thunder and lightning. So they had these same stories, and they spoke the language of Nahuatl, but they were able to keep some of their Nicaragua legend stories and incorporate that into the Nahuatl culture. So we are where we are is so special because this is actually the southernmost point of the Aztec Empire, and when you go south from here, it completely disappears because they found their heaven on earth here.
Right.
And they consider this to be a portal to the other world, and so they revered it enough not to move their empire here because that would be disrespectful, but they would bury their leaders and their rulers here. And caciques were buried on this island because they considered this vortex to be a portal to the other world where you can commune with the gods.
Fascinating. Wow.
And they also, if you look on a map where we are, not only is Nicaragua the most central country in Central America,
Yeah.
you zoom out and you look from Canada to Argentina, and this is the most centered country of all of America, not the equator, but actual where landmass is.
Yeah.
And then the middle of this is a lake, and the middle of this is an island. So we're in the middle of the middle of the middle of America, this whole continent that the North American Native Americans called Turtle Island.
Yeah.
But the Mesoamericans said rose on the back of a crocodile, and we're in the center of it. So there's a lot of mythologies that talk about this being the womb of the world, where all the universe was created from, specifically this spot right here, because the prophecies of the eagle and the condor, which says that they'll be reunited, the tribes from the south and the tribes from the north. Well, if you had to unite the tribes from the north and the tribes from the south, there's no way you can cross without crossing into this place.
Right.
This is the center of it, and they actually did find pottery and archaeological things that they said are peace offerings from tribes as far north as Mexico and tribes as far south as Colombia, coming to this island to make peace deals.
Wow.
And so this island was then revered as a place of peace, and this fits into today because one of the nicknames for this island is an oasis of peace. And one of the reasons they say this is because this was a peaceful place always. In fact, when you look at the history of this island, going back all the way back 3,000 to 4,000 years to the indigenous people who made petroglyphs here, there was not a single piece of evidence that they ever fought a war or a battle, not even once on this island.
Wow.
In fact, when I did look into this, there was exactly one time a like sort of fight broke out near Altagracia in the 1800s between the Spanish and some of the native people here, and a dozen people died. And that's the only time that I ever looked into their history where there was ever a war where there was a significant amount of people that died, and it was like a dozen or two. So this really is an
and
island
you
of
can
peace.
feel it here.
Oh yeah.
You can. This is, I think, the most peaceful place I've ever been. Just in terms of like the feeling scape, just walking around, and the people feel so calm and at peace compared to most other places I've been. And
Now that's not to say that there wasn't the Spanish didn't commit genocide here.
well, I was just going to say,
Because-
weren't there a bunch of
'cause-
people taken as slaves here
Yes,
too?
definitely. In fact, when the Spanish first arrived here, which was around the year 1524, in their second expedition through the Nicoya Peninsula, and they met Cacique Nicarao, and there's a funny story with that too. They did enslave them, and they did kill them, and they shipped a lot of them to Peru to work in the silver mines there. In fact, when you look at Quechuan Peruvian blood, there's a lot of Nicaraguan lineage found inside Peruvian blood today from this time period. And they estimated in a census taken in the 1500s that there was around 10,000 indigenous people living across 25 different communities on this island. But then 150 years later, when they took another census in 1680, there was 325 people left living on the island, indigenous people. It was a 95% genocide. They decimated the population. And with that, they took their stories as well. And why do we not know where there are caciques buried? It's because we haven't either found them or because there's still a church sitting on them today. because the Spanish loved to put a church in the most sacred places of the indigenous people as their version of, look, we conquered you, right? Yeah. And so sit down and do what we say.
At that time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was ruthless what the Spanish did here, and they showed absolutely no mercy.
Yeah.
Again, they didn't have cacao. They had alcohol driving their blood and their brain, and the indigenous people here had cacao. So
they had alcohol and a warped mythology in their Christianity.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how can you stand against something if you show up with flowers and beautiful elevated speech, and the other person shows up with alcohol and a gun?
Yeah.
Who's going to win that fight?
Yeah. Exactly.
It wasn't a fair one.
So then, okay, so yeah, great that we circled back around to the Spanish. I'm curious to get into, like, so obviously they came in, they had no mercy, they dominated the indigenous folks of these lands in Central America, Mexico, and they took cacao back to Europe, but they probably suppressed it here, I imagine. And then, so maybe just discussing, like, what was that kind of dynamic with, like, taking it back and their interaction. And then they did take it back, and then that grows into eventually some kind of world trade system of cacao. Right. So now cacao isn't just in Central America where it's indigenous to, but it's a world seafaring plant,
so
medicine.
There's about 300 years of history with a lot of things that happened, and I'm going to not cover most of that.
Sure.
If anybody is actually interested, there's a book written by Co. & Co. in 1994 called The True History of Chocolate, which traces a lot of the details of this the last 500 years, and especially what happened after the Spanish arrived. But when they started to kill off the native population, and they were, during this time, cacao arrived somewhere between 1550 and 1584, started to arrive to Europe. From 1584 onward, there was regular shipments of cacao beans, and all the cacao in the world up until the 1800s was still being grown exclusively in Central America, South America, and some in the Caribbean islands. But as they started to decimate the workforce here, and they started to then bring slaves from Africa here to refill that workforce so that Europe can get slaves, when the Industrial Revolution kicked off across Europe and people started to actually make edible chocolate, and then the names like Van Houten, like Lindt, Cadbury's, and Henry Nestle show up, they're thinking, what is their move to get this cheaper? Because at this point, it's expensive to get cacao. It is still considered a luxury item for the aristocracy, but when Nestle invents powdered milk, and he was a milk guy, and he wants to mass produce chocolate, he has to find another solution for his beans. So then they go and they decide their move is to exploit Africa. And it's believed that cacao arrived to Africa first by a Portuguese sailor who took the tree or the fruits from Brazil and put it in an island off the coast of Western Africa in the early 1800s, and then in the middle to late 1800s is when you just see it show up and start being grown in Africa. So somewhere in this 50-year period, I believe the first harvest out of Africa, and again I would have to double check my notes just to say if I'm saying the right date, but it was around the year 1878 was the very first time cacao was actually harvested out of Africa. So it's not from there at all. It was brought over there by Europeans for the specific purpose of then colonizing this tree in another continent in order to get it so cheap. So they brought it down there. They started to exploit the farmers down there using their same colonial tricks, their same enslavement of human people. And frankly, Africa is closer to Europe, and these reasons started to drive down the price of cacao. And then it took off from there. Once cacao was cheap, then they were able to then mass produce it on a big scale.
Right.
And part of their plan, whether they intended to do so or not, this is how I see things, is that they intentionally took the spirit of cacao out of cacao. By pressing cacao and by splitting out its fat and its fiber, it's a mechanical process. By defattening it, by adding potassium carbonate to it, which is an alkalizing salt, it chemically lowers the bitterness. You're removing the essence of this thing to become something that you don't even recognize, which is alkalinized cocoa powder, which is like, many of the biggest corporations use this as their main product in chocolate. And I think the origins of why I don't know if they chose to do it like this, but it's a way that the patriarchy that we live in and capitalism and monotheism kind of conspired together, or just coincidentally fit together hand in glove, to take the spirit of cacao out of cacao. Because this was something from the Mayans and the Aztecs, and to some of the more rigid Europeans, they considered them to be demon worshippers because they were essentially pagans. I mean, they worshipped the sun, the moon, the stars, and the forests.
Yeah.
And
Cacao's this feminine spirit, kind of this like Mother Earth type deity, which is probably very much against that fatherly, dominating, monotheistic
Right.
orientation that they carried.
and you can get high on cacao. And they did not want, they understood that they love it, it makes them happy, but they don't want people to know that you can get high on cacao because they like to suppress things that make you think outside the box, unless it's something that makes you think inside the box. So
Yeah.
they legalized tobacco, they legalized coffee and chocolate, but they wanted to denature it. This is a
Right.
feminine plant, and so they started to use phrase like eat chocolate in moderation. Chocolate's not so good for you. Capitalism was like, this is perfect because it is the most expensive ingredient, so let's use it as like an add-in and not the main thing. And so
Mm.
milk chocolate was perfect for that solution. Let's fill it with sugar and milk and other fats and processed garbage so that people don't really know that there is a spirit in cacao, because it is dose dependent, and if you
Mhm.
don't consume enough of this, you won't feel any of its effects. And so the cheapest forms of Africa started to show up, and they were literally, I mean, since the beginning of the time that it arrived to Africa, there has been involvement in human slavery from the beginning of African production. Even Cadbury's, which kind of has like a bit of a Christian, good, wholesome image in the UK. It's like their main brand, like Hershey's.
Mhm.
They got into a scandal in 1907 and 1908 for using adult slaves, and that was like 115 years ago. What are we now, right? It's crazy.
Wow. Yeah.
And then it kind of went underground a bit, but it never really stopped. And then in the year 2000, the BBC uncovered child slavery in Western Africa, and specifically the biggest countries that grow cacao, which is Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast,
Yeah.
and Ghana. And
Okay.
so today, about 60%, or even just over 60% of the world's cacao beans come from these two small countries, and there is rampant child slavery there.
Today.
Today. Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Reports released not just in the last few months, I mean, show that somewhere between 1.5 and 2.1 million children are working in slave-like conditions. And just to be
Yeah.
clear what I'm talking about, because I think it is it is important to choose my words carefully,
Yeah.
right? I'm not talking about a family has a farm and their children do chores on the farm. Why would that be child slavery? That's not even child abuse in my mind, because that's as old as human time,
Sure,
right?
sure.
Children are actually trafficked and sold into slavery. They're not
Mhm.
paid money. They're forced to work and they cannot leave. A lot of them aren't born in these countries. They are trafficked from countries like Burkina Faso or from Togo or from Mali, and they're then sold to farmers through trade of human traffickers into Ghana and the Ivory Coast.
Mm.
A lot of these children are under the age of 10, and they have no option to leave, nor are they receiving income for what they're doing.
Mm.
And they're working with dangerous chemicals, and they're working with machetes. And there was a lawsuit not that long ago about this. Now, this lawsuit hasn't gone very forward
Okay.
because it's a complicated issue. It's not a
Mhm.
complicated issue. It's a moral. It's clear that it's a moral problem.
Right.
But legally, who do you sue, and how? Do you sue American companies? Well, this is a problem in Africa, but the ones who are involved in this are also based in Switzerland, and they're multinationals. Who do you sue? And this was the big question to them.
Right.
Which court is going to listen to a child enslavement when the ones who are doing the enslavement are being manipulated because of systemic poverty due to multinational corporations who don't own the farms?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is still happening, and it is enough to legally say that there is not a single large-scale manufacturer of chocolate anywhere in the world who can claim that their cacao does not come from child slavery, at least in part.
Say that again.
There is not a single large-scale manufacturer of chocolate anywhere in the world who can claim legally that their cacao does not come from child slavery, at least in part.
Wow.
And I choose my words carefully when I say this,
Yeah.
because not all African cacao is problematic, and I don't want to discredit any farmers. There's about 40 to 50 million people in Africa who rely on the cacao industry as their livelihood, and most of them are doing incredible work. So credit's due where it's due. There's a lot of great cacao coming from Africa, but the problem of why it needs to be highlighted today is because some percentage of it does still come with child slavery. We really don't even know how much. Estimates put it really high, but we really don't even know how much, and that is simply a problem of traceability, transparency, and ethics within the supply chain. And these are all systematic issues that are solved immediately as soon as you actually have the education of the consumer to put the pressure on the corporations who are exploiting the workers there to make these systemic changes. So the biggest chocolate company in the world is Barry Callebaut, which probably most of you listening have never heard this name before. They're the company who's behind buying and selling most of the world's beans. Why have you never heard of them before is a question I ask everybody. It's because they don't want you to know they exist, right? Or at least if you do know they exist, what you know is the face that they show you, which is that they're a fine chocolate maker. They make high quality chocolate products, and they're everywhere in the world, and they go into trade shows, and it's a European country based in Switzerland, processing chocolate mostly in Belgium. Okay. But what we don't see is that they have been trying their best to sort of sweep things under the rug. They'll say something out of one side of their mouth, they'll do something with the other side of their mouth. And this is like the most perfect example of greenwashing, that if they spend a fraction of 1% on sustainable projects every year, but then they spend 5% marketing that they're doing sustainable projects, well, why not just take all that money you're going to put in sustainability, keep your mouth shut, and just do the thing that you're going to do and see the results and not have to share the world that, oh, look, we're trying our best, because they will still say on their website, last time I checked, that they are committed to eliminating child slavery within the industry by the year 2025. I mean, I read this maybe a year ago, so maybe their updated is wrong, but they also said, if you go way back, in the year 2000, that when all of this came to light from the BBC, and they were publicly embarrassed by this, that they were committed to eliminating the worst forms of child slavery by 2005.
The worst forms.
That's a good point, because so when this first came out, the U.S. and the European Union, the two biggest consumers of chocolate, they got together and they got pretty upset about this. They're like, this is unacceptable that there's child slavery within the industry of chocolate.
Yeah.
Right? Because most of the chocolate, or not most, but a lot of it is ending up in Halloween candy, literally given to children. Right? This is a dessert, a candy bar.
Yeah.
So why would there be child slavery needing to be involved when it's a product? So the governments got together, the EU and the US, and they wrote this legislation called the Hearkening and Protocol. You can look this up, and anyone listening later can look this up. And the idea behind this bill was actually incredibly sincere. They said, we're going to eliminate child slavery, and we're going to do so right away. They would have required strict regulation on the industry. They would have required a child slave-free stamp on every piece of chocolate sold worldwide, or at least in their markets. And they were going to go after them with force. Well, right before it got passed, the three biggest candy companies in the world, Mars, Hershey, and Nestle, Ferrero now and Mendelez Group, which is owning Cadbury's, Milka, and also they own Oreos, they spent a lot of money on lobbying. And right before the bill passed, a lot of the teeth of this bill was kind of stripped away. So what it required, they changed the language, and they said, instead of eliminating child slavery, period, they changed it to say, we are committed to eliminating the worst forms of child slavery, which is very different.
Very different.
And that they would, instead of actually regulating it, governments regulating it, that they would pay for a organization called the ICO, or ICOO, it's one of these names, to regulate what's going on in Africa. Now, the International Cocoa Organization, that's what they're called, is funded by the biggest manufacturers of chocolate in the world. And you go on their website and you can read the stats and how much cacao is exported around the world, and they're supposed to go and do the due diligence. But they're not, because they're still funded by the biggest candy companies. So what they're saying is, let us regulate ourselves, and we promise to do our best. And they were supposed to hit these goals by 2005. 2005 comes and goes. They don't even have a study done on this. So they said, we need more time for the study. Okay, the government say, we'll give you till 2008. 2008 comes and goes. They said, listen, we have a study, but it's going to take years to implement this now. Okay, they said, we'll give you to 2015. Came and went, right? And then they said 2020. Again came and went. And now the barrier is that you have to solve this by 2025, but that's next year. They're not going to solve this by 2025, even though the EU has passed some landmark legislation requiring the traceability of products entering the EU. Because even in the year 2020, when they were supposed to have solved this, 40 million kilos of untraceable cacao entered the European Union that year. Untraceable. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
Right? They don't know where it's coming from? Are you serious? or that they don't want you to know where it's coming from.
Of
course. And they didn't even keep it. Half of that they sold to the U.S.
Oh.
Because a lot of the trade goes from Africa
Yeah.
to Europe and from Europe to the U.S.
Okay.
So that's kind of how these, as a commodity,
Yeah.
which cacao is traded as a commodity, that's kind of how these things move around the world.
Yeah.
And they built this system. They built this system to do three things, right? Which is keep the cheapest flow of cacao out of Africa, which the farmers there are experiencing extreme levels of poverty. Less than half of the poverty line is what the average family makes if they have their own cacao farm, which is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
Seriously extreme. So how can you eliminate child slavery? And how can you bring transparency into this?
Yeah.
Right? It's a very simple. Now, I don't need 20 years to study this issue to give basic solutions. It starts with one thing. Give the farmers more damn money. Raise their wages. Don't just double it. Don't just give them 50% more. Triple, quadruple, or give them 5x more, right? Because this is a valuable thing, and we as consumers appreciate the value. Now, I'm not going to turn around and tell consumers that they should expect to pay $100 for a bar of chocolate either. That would be unreasonable. But a typical kilo of cacao has a value to it.
Oh yeah.
Right? And so if we make chocolate at home, because we buy the bricks and we like to make our own drinks, we understand that that has value. But you go to buy a Kit Kat bar, and how the hell is that $2? Because the retail shop makes money even from selling it at $2. The manufacturer makes money. The farmer made maybe 1 cent off that deal. Right?
It's mind-blowing. And maybe you can just explain briefly, like, it has value for so many reasons, but also, like, it's not just abundantly growing and flowing and, like, easy to harvest, and, like, there's all these complexities in that it's kind of growing at different times of the year, and you're needing to always check on the plant, and then when you harvest, you can only harvest by hand. Like, there's all these things, but there's actually, like, labor intensity. You can't just go in and rake it all up at one time a year and there you go. It's this year-long process of.
So it is a fruit that grows on a tree. The trees don't produce that many fruits in a year, maybe 100, maybe a bit more for some varieties. But each fruit ripens one at a time, and it's like a berry. And so it's a year-round fruit, but there are peaks and there are valleys. And so in some months you can harvest, many in a month, and some months you can harvest almost nothing in a month. And every fruit has to be picked by hand, every single one. There's no robots or machinery that have ever come to do this. So it's labor-intensive, because once you harvest the fruit, you have to act immediately, because within 3 to 5 days, once you've picked it off the tree, it loses 80% of its sugars. And without the sugars, you can't ferment the beans. Without fermentation, you're not going to have tasty chocolate. So how a typical farm day, what it actually looks like, and I do this myself a lot with the locals here in Ometepe, is we go up to the trees, we wake up kind of early, and we start to beat the heat of the day, and we start picking from each tree. We go tree to tree to tree, and you revisit every single tree every single week. And this is also why 95% of the world's cacao is grown on small-scale farms less than 5 hectares in size. The average is 1 to 2 hectares of a cacao farm. So you pick the fruit, and then as soon as you pick it, that same day, you open each one up, you take out all the beans, you get it into a sack. Typically, you then put that into that sack and have to carry it down a mountain, or you have to bring it to wherever it's being fermented, which can either be on the farm or in a central village. And you have to get it into those boxes, those fermentation boxes, ideally within 4 to 6 hours of once you start opening the fruit, because fermentation happens right away. So it's a full day process to sit there and harvest a couple thousand fruits and to start a fermentation box.
Yeah.
And a couple thousand fruits is not going to make that much chocolate, at least on a global level of what we think commercial chocolate is. Growing
How much
up,
does it make?
it's hard for me to estimate.
Like when I buy these bricks here, what are the small ones? How many kilos is it? Or?
The small one is a pound, the big one is a kilo.
Okay, so a pound of cacao, which is a lot, but also, if you're having it every day or every couple days, like, it goes by quickly. How many cacao beans might need to go into making that pound?
Depending on the size of the fruit, I'm going to give you a range. Okay?
Yeah.
30 to 60.
Wow.
30 to 60 fruits
That's
to make
a
1
lot.
kilo. It is a lot.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. And so all of those have to be picked completely by hand.
Yeah.
And then once that fermentation process starts, and then every week you're doing it over and over again. It is a non-stop, it's a year-round work to make chocolate.
Right.
what people see in the US or Europe is they only see half of that step. Imagine if you made wine, but not in a vineyard. Imagine if grapes were grown on one continent and winemaking was done on another continent.
Right.
How we would be so desensitized to the value of wine, because you don't see the whole process, you just see the manufacturing side. And they do a good job at pushing that narrative that chocolate is just somehow magically there all the time, made in factories.
Right.
I was fed the story of Willy Wonka, maybe you were as well, this Charlie and the Chocolate Factory story, which doesn't come close to telling the story of chocolate.
Yeah,
it tells literally half the story from the factory to the retail shop.
Yeah.
But how does the beans get to that factory? How does this fruit get to the factory?
Right.
Because none of the fruits grow in Europe. They can only grow within 20 degrees north or south of the equator. So they have to physically be fermented, harvested, opened, fermented, sun-dried, and then from there, those beans can be put into warehouses, put on cargo ships, and shipped to another continent, where then the other process starts. And the thing is, most of that money, the industry of chocolate, which you can estimate is worth yearly between 130 and 150 billion dollars.
Wow.
Most of that money stays in Europe or the US. Very little that gets back to the countries that grow it. And country of origin matters so much. To just go back to this child slavery piece, again, when I talk about this, I'm careful to choose my words, because it's important to paint things accurately as they are, neither to exaggerate it nor to diminish it. But there is no child slavery in Central or South America in the industry of chocolate, right? So when people say country of origin matters, it matters maybe the most. And when I meet people who ask me, well, I see this chocolate in a shop, is it ethical? The first question I respond to is, well, where does it come from?
Yeah.
Right? And if I know that it says, it says on the label, it says Guatemala, or it says Nicaragua, and I'm like, amazing. Now, maybe they're not paying the highest prices to the farmers. Maybe they're paying just the market price, and they can pay better prices. And that's something that is a lot more nuanced and is really up to the individual. And we play this capitalism game that tries to get cheap commodities.
Yeah.
But you can be certain of one fact, and that there's no child slavery involved in that harvest, and there's a lot more respect to it. And not only that, typically the varieties that are growing around Mesoamerica are more potently psychoactive than the varieties that they're today growing in Africa, because what they're trying to grow in Africa is to do more monoculture, more of this like CCN 51 stuff that's more high producing, high yield, disease resistant, and frankly flavorless chocolate. But that's their goal. Their goal is to make this productive and cheap as a crop, and do something that exploits farmers. Whereas when people talk about ceremonial cacao, although there is no legal definition for what ceremonial cacao means, the best ceremonial cacao ought to be coming from Mesoamerica. It should be high quality cacao. It should be coming from areas that traditionally have always grown cacao, and find ways that you can go directly to the families, to the farms, and make direct contributions to them and their lifestyle, so that they can maintain their life with dignity.
Yeah.
Right? We're talking about dignity. To be working with cacao. We value cacao. We love cacao. We are the only species on planet Earth that eats cacao, the bitter seed inside. And it's so important that we understand the relationship that we have cacao as a medicine, both as for its psychoactive properties, its cardiovascular health properties, what it does to our lymphatic system, what it does to as an anti-cancer, as an anti-ager, what it does to all of the properties in our body, every organ
can we
in the body.
explore that a little bit more?
Sure.
Like, what are some of the most prominent medicinal effects? Like, aside from it being this, like you were exploring at the beginning, how the Aztecs and the Mayans, they would use it for like couples therapy, for example. So there's this obvious like heart-opening, connective capacity that's present. But what is science discovering, and what are we learning about it now that's showing like really promising medicinal benefits?
A lot. You've heard that this is a superfood, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is one of the most superfoods of superfoods, really, when you look at its pharmacological makeup, or the genetic makeup of this fruit. It's so chemically dense in rich alkaloids and antioxidants that it takes years to study each property inside and what it does. But I'll give you the main ones, right? I've mentioned theobromine a couple times. for anybody listening that doesn't know or maybe has never heard of this molecule, theobromine is a vasodilator, meaning that it literally physiologically opens up veins, arteries, and to allow more blood flow through the body. And where is the biggest arteries and veins in our body? It's in our heart space, right? So physiologically speaking, it's a heart-opening medicine. You hear a lot of people talk about cacao in a spiritual way, and they say, "Oh, this is such a heart-opening medicine." Well, literally, yes.
Yeah.
Not just spiritually, yes, or I feel this emotionally, yes. It is literally opening up your heart, and they found in studies that if you eat as little as 10 grams of cacao a day, which is even below the dose, you'll feel the psychoactive properties. This is dose dependent.
It's like
25 grams and
microdose.
up. It's like
Kind of.
it's like half a dose.
Okay.
You are still going to lower the risk of all cardiovascular heart disease by around 40%.
Wow.
It's an anticoagulant, so it breaks up and lowers the risk of blood clotting. It lowers your blood pressure. It helps with cardiovascular heart attacks, heart disease, stroke as well. So if you eat chocolate every day, the odds that you are going to have a heart attack that day or have a stroke that day are reduced by about half, just by eating a very little amount of cacao. So its heart properties are immense. Its antioxidant levels off the charts. I mean, we're talking about more antioxidants than blueberries, acai, green tea, and red grapes put together,
Wow.
and then double that.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Okay.
In the raw fruit. Just to
In
be-
the raw fruit.
in the raw
Okay,
fruit. But
yeah.
however, if you roast cacao, you don't make it unhealthy. That's another myth that I like to bust with people, because there's this big raw cacao movement,
Yeah.
and I used to be in that, right? I'm a big fan of eating raw fruits, and we
It's
should.
delicious.
You know, as a
too.
raw fruit, this
really,
is
really good.
really one of the healthiest
was
fruits you can eat.
Pleasantly surprised at how delicious it is.
Right, but
Yeah.
when you roast the beans, if you do like a light to medium roast, you maybe
Yeah.
lower the antioxidant properties by about 10 to 20%, and that's not a lot at all. You're lowering it from its ORAC score from around 100,000 down to about 80,000, which is still 40 times more than blueberries.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what you also do by roasting it is you break apart its phytic acids. And phytic acids are described as anti-nutrients that are found inside many fruits that prevent your body from being able to absorb the minerals inside. And we know that cacao is the highest source of magnesium in the world. It's got more iron in it than meat has inside. Red meat is the highest plant-based source of iron in the world. It has lots of calcium, more than cow's milk, potassium, manganese, selenium, chromium. These are all essential minerals for healthy blood and a healthy brain. You can look up selenium and what does that do for the body, and you're like, wow, I need cacao in my diet. You can look at what does zinc and copper do for our blood and transporting nutrients around our blood and helping with our red blood count. Cacao is full of zinc and copper, and these are essential minerals. So it's got an antioxidant powerhouse. It's got this potent, dense, nutritious minerals inside that promotes it, which are more potent if you roast the beans. By breaking apart the phytic acid, you actually absorb more magnesium and iron into your diet with a roasted bean. So if you both raw cacao and roast cacao are incredibly healthy. And when I say raw cacao, I mean like the fruit.
Yeah.
When you eat this fruit, the pulp around it also has vitamin B and vitamin C and vitamin D and vitamin E. The anti-aging properties of its antioxidants literally mean that you slow down aging. And you can visibly see this in people who consume a lot of cacao in their diet, that they're slowing down their aging process and actually reversing their biological age. Because we age twice. We age in two different ways, to be more accurate. Chronologically based on the sun and biologically based on our cells, and that's dependent on lifestyle. So you can speed up the aging process, you can slow it down, and if you're already at an advanced aging step, you can actually go back and cellularly you can go back in age.
Wow.
If you change from eating the standard American diet to all of a sudden eating a whole food plant-based diet, which is biodiverse, dense, lots of fermented foods, lots of raw fruits, lots of healthy, nutritious sprouted foods, and cacao as a part of that, you can literally not just knock 8 years off your age, but you'll look younger than you did before.
So does cacao help repair telomeres? Telomeres being, you don't know about that? Oh, okay.
Not sure.
Telomeres are like the end, it's like the end of your DNA strands.
Okay.
And there's like a certain amount that's like on your DNA, and as your DNA reproduces over the lifespan, you lose bits of it.
Okay.
And so every time it replicates, it gets kind of shorter, and depending on your lifestyle, it'll get shorter quicker. But there's certain things they're finding, like I think broccoli sprouts, sulforaphane or something in it, is like repairing telomeres. So I'm curious to know, maybe look into that, if cacao also has this repair effect.
It would make
probably
sense.
does.
It's also anti-cancer. It
Yeah.
lowers the risk of having cancer. They did a study on the elderly with cacao, which showed that after 10 weeks, the elderly over 85 that ate a little bit of dark chocolate every single day reduced the risk of all vectors of death by 50%. I mean, they're less likely to die after 10 weeks of any reason.
Wow.
Heart-related, mind-related, any reason by 50% because they ate dark chocolate every day.
Wow.
And that was a study done with a control group that ate no chocolate and a control group that ate the milk chocolate. And it was the dark chocolate that had these levels off the charts. We're talking about high percentage dark chocolate, like 85% and up.
And is it a nootropic too?
Meaning?
Meaning, I'm pretty sure nootropic means that it like helps the nerves in the brain like grow and expand and connect.
Neurogeneration.
Neurogeneration, yeah.
It can have those effects because when you consume cacao, the blood flow to your brain increases by about 20% more. So you do feel more mental clarity, more focus, more stimulation,
Right.
and more movement around the brain. So you're able to like work better up there. Cacao also contains, and it's made through the fermentation process, a molecule called salzinol, which is basically a vehicle for the anandamide, which is the bliss molecule, which is an endocannabinoid found also in cannabis and in cacao, which is activating your endocannabinoid system and creating serotonin, endorphins, binding to opium and dopamine receptors. But the salzinol not just delivers the anandamide to the brain, but when it hits the right receptors, it amplifies the effects 2,600 times, which is why the amount of anandamide in cacao technically is trace. It's like very little, but we feel it a lot because of salzinol, which allows for the amplification, which also gives credence to the fact that cacao is an amplifier. If you add cannabis to cacao in a weed brownie, you feel the cannabis more. If you add psilocybin in mushroom chocolates together, you feel the psilocybin more. If you add caffeine in a mocha to cacao, you feel the caffeine more. Whatever is added into cacao, cacao will amplify. And you see this with both anandamide and with phenylethylamine, this neurological love hormone, which is also found inside of cacao. So why do we use it in this way as an amplifier? And this also goes back to touching on ceremonies. To me, when people are doing cacao ceremonies today, it's important to remember a few things. One is that this is not an indigenous practice, really at all. They would use cacao for rituals and for holidays, love, resurrection, the blood, birth and death. But what people call a cacao ceremony today was really invented by white people, and really in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Do I think it's cultural appropriation? That's a subject that I don't want to lend my opinion on very strongly because I see both sides of it. And I don't think you'll find consensus, even amongst indigenous people, about whether it is cultural appropriation or not. Certainly that you could do a cacao ceremony if you call it a Mayan cacao ceremony and you're not a Mayan person.
Right.
Not the best plan, right?
Yeah.
But most cacao ceremonies today are involved with singing, with dancing, and with authentic bonding games.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, also with breath work.
Yeah.
Cacao contains a third xanthine alkaloid called theophylline, which is a brachial dilator. So this brachial dilator theophylline, which is also found inside green tea, is opening up your air passageways, allowing you to breathe better and take in more oxygen. So when you drink cacao and you do breath work, this is why you go deeper into the experience. It's been used to treat asthma and coughing, and they even did studies with pregnant women. If you consume a moderate amount of cacao during your pregnancy, you're reducing the risk your child will have asthma in their life.
Oh, wow.
Also reporting more well-adjusted children. Postpartum, it's great for pregnant women. It's a lacteogog. It helps women naturally produce more breast milk because it's always been associated.
And all the minerals that they're being used up too.
So it was also associated with fertility. So these are the main ideas: love, birth, death, resurrection, fertility, and these sort of concepts were weaved into cacao from the very beginning.
And anandamide is like a key component of entering flow state.
Yes.
What is known as flow state. So it makes sense that like that amplifying effect, but like doing it with dance or singing, that it would help facilitate this flow that we're looking for in our collective ceremonial
I hear people
experiences.
say that you should, when you sing, the spirit of cacao is amplified. Makes sense, right?
Yeah. That's how most indigenous peoples of these lands look at plant spirits and our connection to them. Like you can amplify your connection through singing with
and
them.
just to go back, because I almost lost that thread of thought that I started on, for me the most important part of a cacao ceremony is the intention you put itself. Because inside cacao, and there are crystals in cacao, and crystals charge energy. These crystals can store inside, like water can store, memories, emotions, and intentions. We can store memory in water. Water can shift shape its form and crystallize different patterns. So can cacao, which is why when we think about chocolate or we just smell a delicious cup of cacao, why our memories from childhood of other times we've drinking cacao come back up, and there are these amplified, warm, emotional memories. But intention matters so much. So however somebody does a cacao ceremony, for me it's personally fine, as long as respect for the cacao and where it comes from is acknowledged, and knowing the source of that cacao is a big piece of that, and it should be from Mesoamerica. A grade cacao, quality cacao, psychoactively potent cacao. It should be a ceremonial dose of cacao, which is 40 to 50 grams, and some people can get higher on less, right? But if you're going to sit and serve cacao to somebody and you're going to call it a ceremony with that respect, should you even call it a ceremony? That's it for, again, for other people to have that discussion. And I'm a listener of that. Some people say, don't call it a ceremony, call it a circle. Again, I'm listening to everybody, and I'm not sharing my opinion about it very strongly. But the one thing all cacao circles or cacao ceremonies should have in common is you put your own intention into it. Because whatever intention you do put inside, that stays in the drink and then is amplified. So remember, this is a medicine that is so good physiologically for our body, but also for our heart and our spirit. And so how do you train that medicine to do the work you want it to do is through this intention.
Right.
And this intention is not just being amplified with cacao, but this intention is incredibly potent because our thoughts will create our words will create our actions. Everything comes from a thought. And our thoughts are so powerful that you don't even need to say what your intention is out loud. I believe very strongly that just thinking an intention into a cup of cacao is enough to allow that intention to get caught up in those crystals and then charge the whole drink. And when you then drink this cacao, the spirit of cacao can go do that work. It's a very gentle, she's a very gentle spirit, the spirit of cacao, but she is loving and she is potent and powerful at the same time. And the lessons that she brings us is one of love. Really it is. And to find that love within ourselves, which is that third molecule, phenylethylamine, which is a neurological love hormone that is linked with bonding and intimacy, which is why with cacao we feel a more connectedness to one another, to our body itself during the experience of it, and to the nature world around us. It allows us to soften ourselves, open up ourselves, become more vulnerable, and then feel this connection that is this love that's already inside of us. And then through all of that, our body also goes and produces more oxytocin. So it makes us feel just generally more connected, more bonded, more loving, more emotional. And these are some of the beautiful things that the spirit of cacao is working in our body. It's on these main general themes of it.
I love it. I know we should start wrapping up right away. I have like 3 more questions.
Okay.
One of them is personal, so I'm going to ask the other 2 first, and these are more just kind of like numbers because I'm curious and I want people to know. So one of them is like, I've heard about there being an issue with heavy metals in cacao, and I know I asked you this earlier, but it'd be great for you to share what you know about that with folks. So that, and then also, I don't think you touched on it, but like, what is the percentage of cacao being produced in Central America compared to Africa, and like the numbers around the amounts being produced here versus there, as well as the numbers around like financial, how that's trickling down. So like how much of the financial component of the big cacao game around the world is actually making its way to small scale farms. I think you kind of mentioned something around that, but
Sure.
so those are the 2 that
Okay.
I'm curious about.
So the first question was about heavy metals,
yeah.
right? In terms of the 2 ones that made the headlines was lead and cadmium. So lead is more of an issue from Africa because of it's not the cacao itself, it's transportation. They put cacao on the side of the road to sun dry, and the trucks that pick it up drop diesel on the shelves. That's another reason why you should know where your cacao is coming from. But the other thing about the cadmium, which is present in soil and some of the ones in Central America might have more of it. But cacao, because of what it does with our lymphatic system and some of the other pharmacological genetic makeup of cacao, it has this chelating effect where it actually binds the heavy metals in your body and then pulls it out of your body. So this is why we experience this physiologically, because cacao makes us want to drink more water and go to the bathroom more often, because we're pulling heavy metals out of your body.
Right.
So let's do a numbers game, right? Cacao has oxalates. Oxalates in other foods like red meat or spinach crystallize with calcium and form kidney stones. And so you can look at that in a vacuum and say cacao will lead to kidney stones. But actually, when they studied this, cacao lowers the risk of kidney stones because those oxalates come in, bind to other calcified oxalates, and then pulls it out of our body. So let's say there's cadmium in it, a bit, and it's very little. It's less than most foods. Two enter, but 4 are taken out. So what's the net result?
Right.
Minus
Yeah,
2. You're
minus 2.
losing.
Yeah.
You actually have less heavy metals in your body because you're consuming cacao, even though you're introducing some to your body.
Yeah, so it actually has a detoxing effect for heavy metals.
Such a detoxing effect for heavy metals.
Okay.
So it pulls heavy metals, toxins out of your body, and we feel that in the astringency that makes us want to drink more water, which is why it's a dehydrating substance, and also why we experience the need to either urinate or use the bathroom when we consume high doses of this stuff more frequently.
Okay.
Because it has a net negative effect where you're detoxing your body specifically from the heavy metals. So I don't think heavy metals are a major issue unless it's lead.
Okay. Yeah.
The other question, which is about the actual numbers.
Yeah,
So
just briefly, like, what is really happening with the financial aspect of it?
Right, so
on the
just
world
over
scale?
70% of the world's cacao is coming from Western Africa.
Yeah.
What's growing out of Nicaragua, according to the official numbers, is 0.16% of the world's cacao. Something
Wow.
less under 0.2% is actually from Nicaragua, and yet that is more than Costa Rica, Panama, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Belize put together.
Whoa.
So Nicaragua is the largest producer of cacao in Mesoamerica,
Yeah.
not including Mexico, right? That has more cacao produced.
Okay.
But you hear about cacao from Central America so much more because the quality is so much better, because it's the finest flavors, the aromas. Outside of Ecuador, which is under 10% of the world's cacao is grown there, but that's because there's one variety in particular, CCN51, which I think about 70% of the Ecuadorian market is just CCN51. Although, to Ecuador's credit, they have some really fine cacao there in their Caray and their Nacional and their Arriba varieties. They also have a problem with CCN51, in my opinion. It's not an heirloom, it's not from there, it's a clone, and it's got very, not, people say, and the experts say, not me, but the experts say it's the least tastiest cacao in the world.
Okay.
So as far as numbers go, Africa dwarfs everywhere else. You also have some pretty big players right now growing in Southeast Asia. Indonesia has a pretty big global market, but because cacao is traded as a commodity, it passes, like most commodities, first from the farms to these big warehouses where they're then gathered and sold directly to commodity traders. So there's this idea that farmers, that big manufacturers like Hershey and Mars and Nestle, Ferrero, that they're actually going to the farmers themselves and just buying it all. But no, cacao is grown by small-scale farmers. So how do they aggregate so much? Like, how do you produce 100,000 metric tons a year or more?
Right.
I mean, there are companies that produce in scale.
Yeah.
And that's done through commodity traders. Companies like Barry Callebaut, Cargill, OFI, Olam Food Industries, and others, who are just major commodity players in the world. And they don't just trade in cacao, they trade in sugar, they trade in oils like palm oil, they trade in animal products and feed and all sorts of other commodities. And they're the ones often behind the scenes, behind the factories and the manufacturers that need more scrutinization. They need, somebody needs to be looking at what are they doing, because they're this sort of intermediary player that squeeze the margins out of the farmers. So it goes from the trader, it goes from the countries, from the farms to the countries to the traders then distribute them to the manufacturers, which then make it into chocolate and then redistribute that to retail shops around the world, which is not just supermarkets and grocery stores, it's also all of the ice cream shops and all of the bakeries and the restaurants that have a dessert menu. So
everywhere
you'll find chocolate, right? And so these numbers are just averages, what I share, but if you see a bar of chocolate in a retail shop, you can pretty much guess that the the margins on that price are going to break down something like this. Retail shop will keep about 25% of that retail price from wholesale to retail. The manufacturer, 50%,
Okay.
up to more. Some manufacturers have very high margins. Some manufacturers, or you can look at it one way, somewhere between 75 and 90% of the price you pay is staying with the retail shop and the manufacturer, and their distribution between them. That's 75 to 90% of that price.
Wow.
Traders, depending on their margins and what they do, whether they just sell raw beans or if they make powder or paste from it, could make 5 to 20% of that, and 5% for the farmers. And that 5% can even be as little as 1% for certain products. 1 to 6%. And when I say 5% to the farmers, just to point that a bit more, to look into that a little bit more, that's all of the farmers. What's the other ingredient in chocolate is sugar. So that includes sugar farmers.
Oh.
If there's palm oil inside, that includes palm oil farmers. Right?
Yeah.
They get squeezed on everything.
Whoa.
Right. There are sugar farmers around the world who make less than $5 a day, and sugar farming can be deadly work. People who work in sugarcane fields die at young age of kidney problems in a lot of countries. This is kind of a universal issue that nobody talks about, because we know that sugar is in just about everything. I don't think it's even an exaggeration to say 80% of the foods that's sold contain added sugar to it.
Yeah.
Not all of that is sugar cane, because unfortunately they also use high fructose corn syrup, which breaks my heart to see, because they took the most beautiful thing from Mesoamerica, which is indigenous corn with all of its colors and its nutritional benefits, and they took the spirit out of that one as well.
Yeah.
So sugarcane is definitely a problem, and they also get squeezed on that. So farmers make the least percent on the retail price of a bar of chocolate.
So what you're saying is all the farmers would make that 1%, meaning cacao.
5%, let's say.
Okay, 5%. Meaning the cacao farmers then only make a fraction of that 5 to 1%.
So there's something in Africa known as the farm gate price, which is fixed below the market price for cacao, and legally speaking, it's what a farmer must receive for their product. And it's a guaranteed price, so it's like a government coming in and say, we're going to buy all of your product, because don't worry, the Ivory Coast produces over 40% of the world's cacao. They don't have a market in their own country to sell that much chocolate, so they have to export it. And they can't export it directly, they have to export it through commodity traders because of an old colonial law that's set up in place there. So what are they paying? Well, the price went up this year, which it should have, because the market price of cacao actually doubled last year as a commodity. It went from around $2.50 to $4.50, $4.70 at its peak, which is low. That's for a kilo, actually, of cacao, by the way, and that was a 50-year high. Okay. They hadn't reached that level since 1977.
Wow.
Yeah, so the price of cacao has been way too low for way too long, and yet farmers in the Ivory Coast only got like 11 or 12 cent raise this year, because their price went up from $1.51 to $1.62 per kilo of beans. Yeah. Right now the farm gate price so Ghana had a wilder ride last year. Their price 2 years ago was over $2. Then it dropped to $1.12. Most people have no idea that Ghanese farmers lost 45% of their wages, and then this year it rebounded to $1.84 per kilo of beans, not of fruit, of beans. And so last year, one of the reasons why when the price dropped so much in Ghana decided that they would actually make more money to smuggle their cacao to Togo and sell it at the Togo farm gate price. So there was this whole black market set up to smuggle, because Ghanese farmers were getting squeezed, and they're like, how is it possible that we're losing 45% of our wages when inflation, quote unquote, went up everywhere in the world, which we know now that more than 50% of the price inflation that happened was corporate greed and not actual higher cost of transportation or any of that stuff. So they smuggled a lot of that to other countries, and when Ghana realized, oh, that's a problem because we're losing money from this, they went and raised the farm gate price again this year. How do you solve that? And the answer is direct trade.
Direct trade.
And it's going directly to the farmers themselves and paying them either whatever the market price is, which is going to be 2 or 3 times whatever they're making now as a minimum price, or even pay them higher than the market price. Because why not? Cacao is still too cheap. I'm going to argue every single day that cacao is too cheap. And I'm not going to sit there and tell you that it should get more expensive to the consumer. because the consumer is paying enough money for this stuff. Imagine if 20% of what the consumer paid got to the farmer.
Yeah.
What would that do to their wages? It would
Yeah.
make them actually have a livable wage.
Yeah.
You can probably give a farmer a livable wage on 10% of what the retail price is, because
Right.
but farmers make so much less than that. So you I'm not I'm not acknowledging that there are costs on a manufacturing side to make chocolate, with machinery and transportation,
Right.
and if you have to market it and buy packaging for it, right? And that all feeds into what consumers pay for. But you look at the farmer and just say, food of the gods, right? One of the healthiest foods in the world. Why is it that farmers around the world who grow this stuff are not making a livable wage, not making a dignified wage for what they do, and there's no chocolate without them? So I think educating the consumer is a big driver of that, because until you see this fruit and taste it and go and harvest with locals and see how much labor it actually is to turn this into chocolate, you'll never really appreciate its value, because you're not seeing the story. And you're not seeing the story because the biggest corporations out there don't want to tell you this whole story.
Yeah.
So they'll give you this fake Willy Wonka tour experience where, hey, happy farmers grow our chocolate.
Right.
It's like saying, going to a dairy farm and them saying, well, they're happy cows.
Right.
But what they don't want to show you is what's really going on in the dairy industry, or in the fishing industry, or in the factory produced meat industry, or pick any industry, honestly. Technology, fashion. You go to a bakery, you buy a loaf of bread. Who grew the grain? Who grew the wheat? That isn't that 7 times that wheat could travel around the world and be traded between different partners to sell you a loaf of sliced white bread for less than a few dollars, right? So what are the margins to the farmer on all of these products? And because we have given away our sovereignty in terms of how we consume food to corporations, we don't feel its work. Because imagine if you had to now grow all of your own food, and then somebody turned around to you personally and said, all that work you just did, we're going to pay you $5 for that. And you're like, but no, I spent weeks on that. It's worth more than $5. And they said, well, I'm sorry. We're going to pay you $5 because the market says, because we need to make profit when we sell this to the consumer. So the money's actually in the industry. It's in the middle of the industry.
Right.
And the traders and the corporations and the manufacturers, and the retail shops, the big ones, these are the ones that squeeze the profit out of it. And they don't let that drip down to the farmers. So cut as much of that as you can away. Go directly to communities that indigenously grow their own cacao. Either buy the cacao beans from them or buy paste from them, because it's true in almost any industry that the more you refine the product to its finished, closer you get to a finished product, the more the value rises.
Yeah.
A bar of chocolate is always going to cost more than a block of paste, and the block of paste is always going to cost more than the beans, right? Even though I'm conflicted with that, because to me it's the same. But that's the way things work today. So instead of buying the beans from the indigenous farmer, give the farmer the tool to make his own paste. And then all of a sudden, with one stone grinding machine, or even if they're doing it the old-fashioned way, toasting it over a comal and grinding it on a metate, making that paste, all of a sudden they turn something that was otherwise worth $5 for a kilo to them as beans is now worth $50 for a kilo, right? And now that money stays in that village, or that money stays in that family who owns the trees as well. So the more that the farmers can do to transform their product into a more refined product, the more the market will decide that they should earn more money for that. But my argument is that they deserve more money regardless. They deserve more money for this fruit, right? And that's how people should be seeing it, is that they grow a fruit tree that we find valuable. And we need to find the value for them, because it's ridiculous that there's systemic poverty within the industry of chocolate.
Absolutely.
Because this is food of the god. It's a luxurious item, right? We know that somebody can own a vineyard and become very well off by owning a vineyard. Some people own a vineyard, they become darn right rich, right? So why can't a cacao farmer become rich by growing cacao?
Very strange.
It is very strange, right? And it's because we forgot to pray. We forgot to remember the world back to life is what we did. We're a species of amnesia. And that is a gift and a curse. But we are definitely a species of amnesia, and we are always doomed to forget. And because we forgot, we only remember the story of the last 100 years, which is the Industrial Revolution onward. What happened to chocolate, the denaturing, the taking the spirit out of cacao and turning this into a junk food. We forgot where this comes from. And because we forgot where it comes from, and the people who consume this the most, Europeans and people from North America, they have never seen a cacao tree before until they come here. They've never seen the work that goes into making this either, and therefore they don't know how to value it. So they've given their sovereignty to corporations to just tell them what the value is.
Which is, as we know, never the right choice.
Right, and then they regulate themselves.
Yeah.
It's and then you just get back into this loop. So you get out of this loop by understanding that this isn't a linear process; it's a circular process. And when you get stuck in this direct trade circular loop, well, then the money that goes right back to the beginning, and which is the farmer. The farmer is the biggest part of the whole chocolate industry, and unless a farmer can grow this fruit, there is no chocolate. No matter what you might hear growing up in the US, or what Willy Wonka makes it seem like, chocolate is not a flavor invented in a factory. It is a fruit that is grown on a tree, and it is grown by farmers. And it will always be that way. How interesting is that? This flavor is so complex, but unlike strawberry flavored or grape flavored, what they call purple, right? Or even fake vanilla, which is also a Mesoamerican superfood. All the chocolate in the world is a fruit. There's never something you can make this in a laboratory because of how complex the flavor profile is and how complex the pharmacological makeup is. And I think that's by design. So why is today, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, this emergence of cacao showing up in the world? What changed, right? Because 30 years ago, it was all commodity chocolate. So why today are people doing ceremonies with it? And why today are people using this in a sacred thing? And why today is this idea of cacao growing around the world? It's because we are lacking compassion as a planet, and cacao is a compassionate spirit.
It's touching our hearts.
Exactly,
Opening
and
our
we
hearts
need this
in
medicine
community.
so much.
Yeah. So that leads me into the final question, which is, how has cacao opened your heart? And how has the spirit of cacao guided you? It seems like most of your life is oriented around cacao these days, right?
These days.
So it's kind of like it's taken you up under its wing, so to say, under its canopy in this really beautiful way. And so I'm curious for you to just explore how you see your relationship with cacao now, and how you kind of narrativize the story of your evolution together. And also, I'm calling this project Wild Heart Revival, and I wonder how you might be able to weave that concept into it. Like, how is it opening your heart and maybe connecting you to a more wild understanding of who you are as a creature of earth?
It's a tough question to talk about myself in some ways.
Yeah.
Because, as I alluded to in the beginning, these stories are not my own, and I consider this to be the greatest privilege of my life, that I have been able to work so intimately with cacao, and with really feeling the spirit of cacao, and knowing that what it does to me, what it does to this world. I started to realize that cacao is special here in Central America. Before that, I really did grow up in the U.S. Matrix, where it was just a candy bar. And when I started to go deep into this world, I was listening. Really, I love to read, I love to write, I love to do things, but more than anything, I'm a listener. And so I wanted to listen to what people have to say and to absorb what they're sharing. So I need to go back to what I said in the beginning. The invisible people behind all of this, both the workers in the factories, the ones who work on the farms, the people I have deep admiration for, that go beyond words can even say. How much I admire the people behind all the chocolate that we eat, the ones from this land, the indigenous people. I want to put them before me, because for too long it's been people who look like me putting myself in front of them, and I just think that's ridiculous, and it's got to stop, because their ancestral wisdom is so much more powerful than mine. But as somebody who once was within this world once said in one of those beautiful stories I've ever heard, each one of us, no matter where we come from, have an indigenous seed inside of us, and for most of our life, that indigenous seed is going to be dormant. And for many people, that indigenous seed may never germinate because our parents didn't plant that seed or germinate that seed for us, right? So we walk through this world, like I said, a species of amnesia. We're doomed to forget everything where we come from. But sometimes things happen in your life that germinate that seed.
Yeah.
And this seed in me, wherever I come from on this earth, I'm from this earth.
Yeah.
And this seed was germinated, and it is not yet a beautiful, powerful, tall tree looming over the canopy, seeing everything from afar. It is still a young plant. And so I have this humility to still look up to the elders around me and ask the questions that need to be asked of what more can I learn, because my journey and my growth is not yet there. But I'll speak for myself a little bit and say that, and not for you or any other man who's listening, but generally men are more emotionally closed than women are. And one of the traumas that I had to go through my journey of self-healing in order to become the person who you see before me was to accept and understand my fear of vulnerability and my fear of expressing my feelings in an authentic way. Because I went, to be a little bit more personal from this, I went years without crying. Like, unable to cry. I don't remember the last time I cried. I was probably a kid. But I remember the first time I cried again, and that was when I was 27 years old. So there was probably about a 15-year gap where I never cried once. I was unable to, because all of my emotions were being suppressed, because this is what I thought I should be done. So I couldn't feel things. And because I couldn't feel things, I couldn't create healthy relationships with people, with partners. It was moving from unhealthy relationships to unhealthy relationships, and not understanding who I am as a person, because my whole life people told me, be grateful for what you have. Even if you don't have a lot, be grateful for what you have. People have less. But you know what? Not a single person had ever asked me until like maybe 7 or 8 years ago, be grateful for who you are. And then this question stunned me. So who am I?
Who am I?
Right? And cacao is a medicine that works with this. Because, especially for me, and I think this is a tool for a lot of men who are wounded with their masculine, this is a tool to allow yourself to express your most vulnerable parts to yourself in an authentic and true way. Use it in that way. Because we need this. It is a feminine plant, and it can ignite a more feminine side to ourselves. But we as men also need this as our work to somehow to be not just fire and creation, but also to soften sometimes, and not to be emasculated either. Like, to hold both powers in you and to use it with clarity and with consciousness. So the spirit of cacao, who I've seen, felt, and have cultivated a very deep personal relationship with, is due completely to the gratitude of the people of this land who have allowed me to work so intimately with every part of the process, from it on a spiritual level to a pharmacological level to a manufacturing industrial level, not a big one, but making chocolate and making drinks and making tasty things with chocolate, and working and creating all of those things. So I owe cacao a lot of gratitude, and if I can do one thing really well, and I'm not even sure I do it that well. People say I tell good stories, and sometimes I just sit here humbled by the fact that there's a flow state going through me. What I like to do the most is to bring the speech, the elevated, high, beautiful, passionate speech of the plants to life. Because as the Mayans said, our purpose as humans is to remember the world back to life again. Remember all the pieces of the divine feminine of nature, that is water, back together. To remember who we are as people back together. Remember, we are the people who walked barefoot on the ground and picked fruit from trees, that sat around the fire and told stories all night long. Elevate the power of these plants and these fruits and these trees, and acknowledge and see once again there is a spirit inside of this. So my gratitude is for the spirits of the plants who only allow me to tell these stories in a way that I can. And it's not ever going to come out perfectly. It's not going to ever come out sort of fluidly, as much as it might seem like that. But this is what I'm supposed to be doing, and every fiber of my being knows that I'm supposed to be using my privilege to elevate the stories of the plants and of the people behind the plants. And cacao is one of those very sacred plants that has given me this opportunity to elevate itself, and especially now as this is making its way around the world in a more spirit in amongst more spiritual circles, and weaving and tying together this connection of what cacao has as a spirit, as its religious and historical and ethical perspective, as its political and economic perspective. Tie all these threads together and see where it takes you. And cacao has the most beautiful story I have ever heard in my life. From where it came from to where it went to, down to the deeps of the underworld, and it's been fermenting there for a while, just like the hero twins. And it's starting to be reborn again as something that is not just a commodity, not just an average bean. It's this special magical being, and that's something special about that. And that's my role, I think.
Well, the stories flowed through you with purpose, presence, and passion today, brother. And it sounds like cacao has connected you to your heart, and to your voice and your expression, and that it's balanced the masculine and feminine within. Amongst all the other things we've explored today, that's a huge gift, and you get to share that, just your presence and your passion and your purpose with the immediate moment with us. And the fact that you get to lift this bean up and these plants up and this community up with that is beautiful. And to honor the peoples of these lands while doing that is essential. So thank you for everything that you're doing, and thank you for being here and sharing your stories in this way.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share the story of cacao and the people of this land and their stories.
Yeah.
Without them, I'm nothing. And I really want, if I can really plant this image, you've any piece of chocolate that you have ever eaten or ever drank in your entire life starts as a fruit. It grows on a tree. It is picked by a person.
Yeah.
These are the stories that I want to elevate.
Yeah.
The story of the people behind it, and the story of the Mesoamericans specifically, because this is their medicine first. And it's with a blessing that we get to, as foreigners, to be on this land and to share in their medicine as well. But I am humbled as a servant before cacao, and as a humble servant to try to elevate and remember their indigenous wisdom back alive again. This is their stories. This is their ancient wisdom. And even if some of them have forgotten it, it's still important to remember where it comes from.
It's incredibly important. Yeah.
So thank you for giving me the opportunity today to share that with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here we are at El Pital. People can find you here. They can learn more about cacao here on Ometepe Island in Nicaragua. I imagine there's a website for this place.
Yeah, there is.
Do you want to direct anybody toward like you? Do you have something happening on social media or anywhere where you share things?
I typically have a pretty low profile online, but Instagram is chocolate fun guy.
Nice.
Fun guy, FUNGUY, chocolate fun guy.
Yeah.
You'll find me there.
Great.
And who knows what the future has in store for me. You know, keep sharing these stories, keep writing things down, and sharing in circles, and I guess I'll end with this. One of my favorite things to do in the world is plant seeds. And I have my own little farm that I'm humbling, planting a little milpa in the traditional style of the indigenous people, just planting fruit trees and other things. So wherever I go, I plant seeds, and this has been part of something I've been doing for years. In every country I go to, I planted a tree around the world. Okay. And so I do this with people too sometimes. And when I get the opportunity to sit down and talk to somebody, whether it's an opportunity to talk to you or talk to whoever's listening to this, if even anybody listens to this, bless you for listening, because I appreciate it a lot. But I hope I planted seeds in your mind, and what I encourage you to do with this seed that's been planted is to really nourish that seed, because I guarantee it will grow into something so beautiful beyond what you can even imagine it to grow into, because that's what seeds do. In order to make a seed grow, you have to give it a funeral. You have to send it to its death underneath the ground, cover it with something, but then give it the water to grow into something new, alive again. Like our seeds that are inside of us, like our seeds that are in our brain, if you feel like a seed got planted, please nourish that seed. It will grow into something incredibly beautiful, and that is both my wish for you and for everyone listening, and it's also in a way my promise, because I know the power of what these seeds can do. And even if we can't change the world, we can change ourselves, and that has so much power for our ancestors and for the generations that come ahead of us.
Yeah,
We
that's
need
right.
we need to change ourselves.
That's right.
It all starts with little actions and little seeds.
Mm-hmm.
So thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, brother. Yeah. Great.